all things considered, there's hopefully a lot of useful advice that's been coming out of this course so far. Things you might want to do more of in your life, things you might want to do less of. And I've even taken some of these points to heart. Never once have I taken a bubble bath, just spiked with glucocorticoids. In college, I wouldn't go out with my buddies and chug down sort of mixtures of prolactin and glucagon. There's a lot of useful stuff that could come out of paying attention to these things. However, this is a lecture where I just have to put all sorts of fine print up front. This lecture, I am an utter hypocrite, because what this lecture is about is how you need to get enough sleep. I personally don't get enough sleep. In fact, there's a guy, a researcher at my university, a man named William Dement, who's like the dean of sleep research. And basically, I live in terror of running into this guy when I'm really looking moth-eaten in the morning, because the whole theme here is you really do need a lot of sleep, because it is highly intertwined with how your body deals with stress. So this is one of those lectures that I plan to pay no attention to as I'm giving it, and thus we've got the main theme of this lecture. This is one of those do as I say, not as I do. So we start off thinking about sleep. And the very first thing to deal with in terms of sleep is it's a totally weird thing to have happen to your body and your brain. And there's all sorts of diseases of abnormal amounts of sleep, as we're going to see in a few lectures. When you have severe clinical depression, your sleep pattern changes in all sorts of ways. There's this disease narcolepsy, where you can fall asleep suddenly, no warning, and often in response to emotional arousal. How's this for a weird disease? There's this disease called Odine's curse, which is due to a certain type of tumor in your brainstem. And what you've got there is, your brainstem isn't working very well, and what you have is a deep problem. Now, apparently, Odine was some nymph or something that Zeus was hitting on, and she was not willing to go along with this. So he placed Odine's curse on her, and what he did was take away her ability to breathe automatically, where she had to breathe consciously. And I'm not quite sure how much the legend got into the physiology of this, but nonetheless, Odine's curse is when, thanks to this tumor, you cannot breathe involuntarily. You have to think about it. And what does this disease kill you from? From lack of sleep, because you go to sleep and 30 seconds later you wake up gasping because you need to be awake to remind yourself to breathe now and then. Totally creepy stuff. Now, that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface when you really think about sleep, and you twitch and your eyelids do things and you sleepwalk at times, which is totally creepy, and you drool and you get penile and clitoral erections, and that doesn't even deal with species that have very odd things going on with sleep. For example, there are species out there that sleep with one half of their brain at a time, and often what that's about is some species that better be on the lookout for predators 24/7. One half of your brain sleeps. There's bird species that are able to sleep while they're flying. There's fish that sleep. And the whole notion of fish sleeping is just weird and everything. There's even fruit flies that sleep. And not only is there sleep, this weird suspended state, it's very structured. There's all these different sleep stages, slow wave sleep, deep rapid eye movement sleep. It's just a very weird thing to have going on in you. Nonetheless, it does. And what we have to start off with right off the bat is what's going on in your brain when you were sleeping. And it turns out it's got to do with which of those sleep stages you were in, whether it's your slow wave sleep, whether it's this rapid eye movement stuff. Okay, typically when you are sliding into a good night's sleep, the first thing that kicks in is this slow wave sleep. It's termed that from when they stick electrodes on your head and monitor your electrical physiological activity up there. And this is a pattern where you've got very slow cycles of activation. And not surprisingly, when you stick somebody into one of those brain scanners at the same time, which we've already heard about, one of the ones that tells you which part of the brain is metabolically active, what you see is with the onset of slow wave sleep, everything is less active. Of course, this makes sense because you've slipped into deep sleep there. Most of your brain has much less activity going on. That makes perfect sense. And we'll see exactly why that makes wonderful sense given a lot of what sleep is about, restoration of energy in your nervous system. But then along comes REM sleep, which is really quite different. REM sleep, and suddenly some parts of your brain become completely silent and other parts become even more active than usual. Okay, which parts become completely silent? Most of the areas, except one particular part of your brain, as we'll see as an exception. But which areas become more active than usual? And one very interesting one is known as secondary sensory cortex. What's that about? You look at something and the information gets into what's termed your primary visual cortex, and it gets processed there, and you extract some information about what's going on, and then you kick that up to your secondary visual cortex and tertiary, and it's doing all sorts of processing. Meanwhile, you've got your primary auditory cortex, that sort of thing. So when you're looking at things that are vivid, when you're hearing a lot of sounds, you get activation of those brain areas, primary, secondary, and tertiary cortex. Something different happens during REM sleep, which is the primary sensory cortex goes silent, and the secondary and tertiary activate like crazy. In other words, those parts of the brains are processing things as if you were having visual information and auditory information without the primary layers activating, without any actual visual auditory information coming in. What's this about? This is dreaming. This is dreaming, active processing of sensory information that simply is not there. This is instead of activation of these layers from your eyes, your ears, it's from whatever parts of your brain are running the dreaming process. So that's one striking thing. Meanwhile, another area of your brain becomes more active than usual, and this is one we remember from so many lectures ago, and this is the limbic system. Limbic system because suddenly you've got all sorts of emotions ripping around your head. There's not a whole lot of us who have dreams about, contrapuntal music or calculus. Instead, we have dreams that are just frothy with emotional content, unless you're the sort of person for whom calculus is frothingly emotional, but for the most part, this winds up being a realm of limbic activation, highly emotive content to dreams. Now, where's the limbic system getting off becoming more active than usual during dream stage? When you think of this as everything in your brain should be going offline, but you've got these secondary, tertiary parts of your sensory system hallucinating away with information that isn't there, dreaming, and you've got the limbic system all activated, the emotional content of dreaming. One additional area, very interestingly, shows not just that pattern of slow wave sleep becoming less active than usual, this one area just hits the basement, turns off entirely. Which area is that? And this is straight out of the previous lecture. What area is this? Prefrontal cortex. What does the prefrontal cortex spend a whole lot of time doing? As we heard previously, it makes you do the harder thing when the easier thing is tempting, when the harder thing is the right thing to do. A lot of what your prefrontal cortex does when it's pulling that off is it's inhibiting the limbic system, saying, oh, no, don't actually try to butt heads with that moose because that's a particularly scary one. A lot of what the frontal cortex does is rein in limbic function. And thus, what you suddenly have during REM sleep when you were dreaming, the frontal cortex goes silent. That's why your limbic system runs amok. That's why in dreams you do all sorts of imprudent things in all sorts of junctures where you don't do the harder right thing, and instead you do with greatly interesting consequences the easier thing. You've got this pattern, frontal cortex goes down. So we've got this odd picture, perfect sense during slow wave sleep, the brain is using much less energy. During dream stage, REM sleep, this very interesting pattern, more of a decrease in energy consumption through most of the brain, but cortical activation, processing imaginary sensory information, the limbic system supplying the weirdo emotive content to it, and your frontal cortex going into a deep, deep sleep where it's got nothing to say that's inhibitory in nature to your limbic system. Okay, so this is a profile in terms of the energetics, what's happening there. And of course, when you begin to think about this, up comes the inevitable question of why is it that we dream anyway? Why is it that we have any of these sleep stages? Most broadly, as the initial question, why do we sleep? Why do we need to sleep at all? And the answer is somewhat obvious in that sleep restores energy. What sleep onset is usually about is fatigue. All of that makes perfect sense. You get tired and thus you go to sleep. You get exhausted by increased activity and you go to sleep earlier and are more in need of it. It's about restoration of energy. What's become clear is what is particularly focused on with energy restoration is in your brain. And that has to do with one of the great factoids. You are not allowed to teach introductory neuro anything or other without pulling this one out in terms of impressing everybody with what a tough, sort of impressive organ the brain is compared to those dumb old kidneys or liver or something. The brain constitutes about 3% of your body weight, and it uses 20-25% of the energy. The brain is incredibly expensive, and that gives you some insight into why your, epididymis, if you happen to have one of those, why it's not the one solving problems for you, why the brain does this fancy stuff. It consumes enormous amounts of energy. So you need to replace those enormous amounts. Just to make things even messier, there's all sorts of cells that store a lot of energy. Back so many lectures ago, storing energy in your fat cells, your liver, your muscle. It turns out brain cells, neurons, are terrible at storing energy. They have virtually no capacity to do it. You get an energy crisis like a stroke, and your neurons have about 30 seconds worth of energy available to them before they crash. There's another cell type in the brain called glial cells, and they're a bit better at storing energy, but nonetheless, your brain uses a ton of it, doesn't store it very well, so a lot of what sleep is about is restoring energy throughout the body and especially in your brain. So that's one of the things it's useful for, and that's the traditional explanation for what sleep's about. It's only in recent years that people have figured out there's an additional thing that's really, really interesting, which is you consolidate memories during your sleep. And we all know this phenomenon, which is you study something right before you go to sleep, you practice a piece of music, whatever, and the next morning it's magically in there to a much greater extent than if you had done that same learning in the morning and tested it towards late afternoon. There's consolidation of memory that goes on in the brain during that time. And there's at least one hint as to how that might work. When you have onset of sleep, what decreases in your bloodstream? Glucocorticoid levels. And we know oh so well by now that high levels of glucocorticoids can disrupt aspects of cognition. Sleep is the perfect time to get rid of those glucocorticoids and do a whole lot of memory consolidation. So what does this look like? This pattern of, you learn a bunch of factoids and it's being consolidated during your sleep, those factoids instead of something else. Some wonderful work by a scientist named Bruce McNaughton has shown that in the brains, in this case in rats, if you show certain patterns of activation in a rat when it's learning some new task, some maze or whatever, right before it goes to sleep, study the brain while the animal is sleeping and it preferentially activates the same pathway. It's running it again and again, getting that information in there. Now, one of the other things you do during sleep is you sleep on it. You do all sorts of things with judgment. And lots of the time we do indeed sleep on it. We come up with some assessment, some insight, some gut feeling, some intuition. Now, in that regard, you don't make a judgment about whether or not the final digit of some phone number was 6 or 7 kind of thing. You're making judgment about complex sort of circumstances. But that comes into it also. So at some point, we then have to deal with the even bigger, more mysterious issue, which is, why do we dream? If sleep is about energy restoration, what's the deal with dreaming? And, there's been a gazillion theories over the years. The purpose of dreaming is to work out sort of the troubled, ambivalent aspects of your relationship with your mother, or you dream in order to keep surrealists and sort of on the dole and working away there. Or, then there's that whole world where you have one of those totally bizarre sex dreams with somebody you never even thought about before, and the next day you act all weird about them around the water cooler. But what's in a lot of ways one of the more convincing explanations as to what dreaming is about is it's a chance to use circuits in your brain that you may have underused during the day. And this is usually summed up in the notion of a use it or lose it kind of model. And if you think about it, this is both perfectly reasonable and utterly contradictory with something I talked about earlier. Okay, so you think about this here, and you need to use a circuit that's underutilized. Suppose, for example, you are thinking far too infrequently about William Seward, Secretary of State in the Lincoln First Administration. And your brain really needs more of this because you are not utilizing that William Seward neuron. You know from so many lectures ago that's a gross simplification. There is not a William Seward neuron. There's instead a William Seward network, and it's the intersection, the network of secretaries of states and the network of stud muffins from the 19th century, and out pops William Seward's name. So you're not thinking about that enough during waking hours. So a notion of what dreams are about is exercising pathways that don't get enough stimulation during the day. So why is that contradictory? Why that's contradictory to something we just heard about? The argument from the work of someone like McNaughton is the very pathways, the very patterns you activate during the day as you learn something, those are the patterns you run again and again at night to consolidate some sort of new information, with this argument that what dreaming is about is activating pathways that otherwise atrophy away. The very pathways that are least active during the day are the ones that get activated at night. It's not quite clear what the resolution to that one is, but nonetheless, what you've got are some very intriguing array of possibilities for what dreaming is about. What is clear, though, is not only insofar as sleep in general is a good point for consolidating memory, REM sleep appears to be a particularly good one. Preferentially disrupt that and you screw up cognition, part of this larger theme of disrupt sleep as a whole, and you get cognitive problems. You don't remember stuff as well. You don't learn things as well, with one very interesting exception. And this was work done by, in fact, an ex-graduate student of mine, Alana Hairston. And what she did was show that there's one domain in which sleep deprivation improves your memory. And it works as follows. It involves something called a reversal task, which is a fiendishly challenging thing for your brain. Suppose you learn some process that you need to do. If you're a rat, for example, it may not be particularly fancy, which is whenever this little light comes on, you've got to hit this lever. If you do it correctly, you get a food pellet as a reward. So you spend all day learning this to the point that every time that light comes on, you are lunging for that lever. You have learned this association. You have learned this task. Now, they hit you with a reversal task, which is all of a sudden, instead of light comes on, hit the lever, you get a food reward. Now, suddenly, without warning, the deal is light comes on, and it's if you don't hit the lever that you get a food reward. You have to completely reverse what it is you've learned. And that's a hard thing to do, except if you were vastly sleep deprived, because it becomes much easier to do a reversal test. How come? Because in the first place, you didn't learn this association very well. You didn't consolidate this rule that when the light comes on, hit the lever. So the next morning, you're not sitting there saying, light comes on, hit the, remember, hit the, okay, it's different now, don't hit it, okay, this is very, because you haven't learned the first thing very effectively at all. You haven't consolidated it, and thus, individuals, animals, humans who are sleep deprived are better at reversal tasks the next day. Nonetheless, this is within a larger framework of sleep is a good thing for memory consolidation. Dreaming has all sorts of advantages there. Yes, you want to get enough sleep and the right distribution of subtypes of sleep. And again, as a warning, we will get to depression, where one of the things that goes dramatically wrong is not only trouble sleeping, but with a very particular pattern and a complete disorganization of the structure of sleep. So now, with the various pieces in place, what is sleep about metabolically in your brain? What purpose might sleeping serve? What purpose might dreaming do? What we now need to do is, of course, superimpose stress on top of this. What's going on with sleep deprivation? Very simply, it's a stressor. If you don't get enough sleep, your levels of glucocorticoids go up in your bloodstream. And in fact, there's a very interesting explanation for this. Back to the lecture, The Basic Organization of Endocrine Systems, the hypothalamus releases a hormone which stimulates the pituitary to release its hormone. Remember, luteinizing hormone, releasing factor, luteinizing hormone, on it goes. What I failed to mention, just as one of those miserable elaborations, some of those brain hormones are releasing hormones. They stimulate the pituitary to release its particular hormone. Some of those brain hormones are inhibitory hormones, ones that decrease pituitary activation. Now, what everybody discovered early on was a releasing hormone coming from the brain, which activates the pituitary to release its hormone, and down at the adrenal, you start secreting glucocorticoids. Just to give you the horrible terminology, CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, that's the hypothalamic hormone, the brain hormone that stimulates glucocorticoid secretion. And what's always been lurking in the background is the fact that there's a hormone that does the opposite, corticotropin inhibiting hormone. And what that seems to do is inhibit activation of glucocorticoids. Nobody's quite isolated what the chemical is, but the best evidence is that it's a chemical that is called delta sleep factor. In other words, it's a hormone that does something else in the brain. It helps onset of sleep. So the very chemical messenger that transitions you into sleep effectively is the same one that decreases glucocorticoid levels. So obviously what we deal with is the flip side, which is if you don't get enough sleep, your glucocorticoid levels are going to go up. Furthermore, particularly so if you don't get enough REM sleep, your glucocorticoid levels are going to go up. So that's a bad thing. That's a bad thing, and deprivation increases the levels of that stuff. And you can show that that messes up cognition in a very typical way. For example, get somebody truly sleep deprived, and the next day their cognition isn't very good. And what does that look like in a brain scanner? What you would expect is give somebody some task and the relevant part of their cortex doesn't activate a whole lot. And what you see, in fact, is exact opposite. In order to pull off the same degree of competence, you have to activate even more of your cortex than usual. What has messed up that ability to focus in your cortical activation? The elevated glucocorticoid levels. So that's not good. Now we have the flip side. We've seen this first piece here, which is sleep deprivation increases glucocorticoid levels. Just to complete this loop, elevated glucocorticoid levels disrupt sleep onset. And that takes all sorts of forms. Glucocorticoids, when they get in and soak your brain, make it harder to transition into slow-wave sleep. Particularly, they're doing something to a brain chemical called serotonin. Stay tuned. Lots of serotonin news coming down the pike in a few lectures. Serotonin, which has something to do with the onset of slow-wave sleep. And by that point, once you have a lot of glucocorticoids, a lot of stress, and you're getting less sleep, you're not doing as much energy restoration in the brain, it's a total mess here. Now, if you think through it, what we've got here is something very disturbing, which is a vicious cycle, a dread vicious cycle going on there of the following sort. So, sleep deprivation raises glucocorticoid levels. Elevated glucocorticoid levels disrupt sleep. And we have a dread vicious cycle, and before you know it, you stay up late one night to watch some late night TV sort of thing, and you're sunk. Because thanks to staying up 15 minutes later than usual, your glucocorticoid levels are higher, and thus the next night you're not going to be able to sleep as well. And it's just terrible, this vicious cycle. Okay, just as one is on the edge of panic there, this vicious cycle is not all that vicious. These two loops do not connect all that much. For one thing being, when you were sleep deprived, yes, indeed, glucocorticoid levels go up. Not that much, though. And on the other side of this circle, no matter how high your glucocorticoid levels are, if you're exhausted enough, you're eventually going to sleep. In other words, all sorts of the other regulatory factors that have some input as to how much sleep you get, eventually they can override the effects of stress. You break that vicious cycle. Nonetheless, you can have periods of quite dramatic problems with sleep built around periods of stress. And as we've seen, a big consequence of that is your brain isn't restoring energy as efficiently as usual. For example, when glucocorticoids get into the brain, they make it harder for the energy restoration to occur. So we've got this vicious cycle here, which turns out not to be quite as vicious as one might initially panic into, but nonetheless, here's a pattern by which lots of stress will decrease your total amount of sleep. Lots of decreases in sleep elevate glucocorticoid levels, and you've got this pattern there. And the net result is the impact of stress on the total amount of sleep you get. Now we transition to something much more subtle, which is what does stress do not to the quantity of sleep, but to the quality of it. And here you see some particularly disturbing news, because the deal is you can get lots of sleep, but if it's not of the right type, a predominance of the slow wave sleep, you don't get the energy restoration. That's the type of sleep that's really important for that going on, and get a lot of glucocorticoids, get a lot of stress going on there, and not only do you tend to decrease the amount of total sleep, you'll also decrease the percentage of your sleep time devoted to that really helpful slow wave sleep stuff. So you sleep, and thanks to all sorts of problems, you have elevated glucocorticoid levels. While you're sleeping, you take all sorts of troubles to bed there, or any sort of plumbing problems there that elevate your glucocorticoid levels. And when you are actually sleeping, there's going to be less slow wave sleep. It's going to be less efficient sleep. It's going to be poorer quality. There's going to be less energy restoration. Now, another feature that stress can do is wreak havoc with more sort of aspects of sleep, and this is where it tells us something very informative about the relationship between stress and sleep quality. And this was some brilliant work done a few years ago by Jan Born at University of Lübeck, and they did the following. Normally, when you're sleeping, you've got this pattern of glucocorticoid release, which we heard about a few lectures ago, which is nice low levels throughout the night's sleep, and somewhere near when you're getting ready to wake up, you begin to have elevated glucocorticoid levels in anticipation of the fact that the most stressful thing every single day and a day without major stressors is that mere process of getting up in the morning and beginning to function. So that's what happens when you have free-running sleep. You sleep until you're ready to wake up. Somehow your brain senses that it's getting near the end of your sleep period, so send that signal, that CRH, to your pituitary, off you go, and glucocorticoid levels begin to rise. What if your sleep is disrupted, though? And in the first version of the experiment, what they told these volunteers, and they got volunteers who slept such that on the average they woke up around 7 o'clock in the morning, and what they told them was, well, you're going to sleep now, we're going to wake you up at 5 in the morning instead. In other words, we're going to disrupt your sleep at a predictable time in a way that's going to compromise the quality of your sleep. What happens now, around 4 o'clock in the morning, glucocorticoid levels begin to go up. There's anticipation of the fact that there is going to be disruption of sleep, and the quality of sleep goes down the tubes then. And I experienced this myself like some years ago, where I was doing one of these nutty, impossible experiments where I had to take blood from some subjects every 3 hours or so around the clock for days and days and days. In other words, you get the blood sample, you process it for 16 and a half minutes, and then you go and crash until 30 seconds before the next one. And overall, I was getting collectively, about 11 hours of sleep each day, because I was spending most of the in-between times just sleeping. And I felt lousy. I felt totally exhausted despite having more sleep, because the quality of it was disrupted, because my glucocorticoid